So this is a impromptu video that I'm making, just very quickly, and in this video I want to talk about Evo-psych. Evo-psych, also known as evolutionary psychology, is the science of trying to explain psychological behaviors through evolutionary mechanisms, so mechanisms that we might try to explain certain kind of natural selection factors. And I have a lot of problems with this approach, and I think that it reflects in the quality of the research. I think that it doesn't have a coherent model. I don't think that it can demonstrate that it's an empirical science that can demonstrate its claims. I think that it also, it's what Evo-psych really comes off like is it comes off like a very poor and poorly constructed set of sociology experiments, actually. And I'll walk through a couple of studies to kind of show how these papers are constructed. And I want to also stress that, I'm not a researcher myself. I'm working with some of my friends who are, training to be researchers, have done research in the past, etc. So they're helping me explain some of these things to me, and I think that it's really important to hear it from my perspective as somebody who's not an expert. Because, most of the people who are going to be watching this are not necessarily familiar with the in-depth politics and, details of research, and I think that when we're in an online environment where we're going around and sharing a lot of research papers to try to prove a certain point or another, we should actually talk about and learn about how these things work, and in a way that's more accessible to everyday people. So first I want to talk a little bit and just kind of briefly go over why I'm not personally a fan of Evo-psych as a sort of, predictive science. First off, just because something can make predictions doesn't mean it's scientific. A lot of pseudoscience can make predictions. I think part of the problem with something like alternative medicine is that it takes advantage of something called the placebo effect. And by taking advantage of that, it's able to give the impression that it actually works, and it's able to make predictions. But the problem is that because we aren't measuring because we aren't measuring those medicines precisely, we're not measuring those different, pseudosciences precisely, that's where all the error comes in. That's where, we think we're making a prediction, but we're really not, right? And we need to be critical of pretty much everything that we encounter. I'm not just critical of Evo-psych, but I'm critical of other, major fields. And I think that it's important to be critical because not only does it give us a better perspective on what the data actually means, because maybe it's okay if it's not scientific. Maybe there's something of value somewhere else to gain from it, right? Not everything can be measured in a way that, forms a scientific consensus in a reliable way, right? But at the same time, it also helps us understand, maybe particularly ulterior motives when people share, particular papers and things like that. And personally, for me, the reason why I don't like Evo-psych as a science is because I don't think that what it's measuring in these studies to try to demonstrate its point about the evolution of human psychology is actually what it's trying to measure. So the subject of Evo-psych is human behavior across time and how it evolves and how it's reacting to various pressures, right? And various ecological, and how it's reacting to various biological evolutionary factors, right? And the problem with this is that we're actually looking at, and what we're actually observing isn't people, changing their behavior over time across many different populations, but rather a bunch of surveys and quite poorly built surveys and, quick experiments using a computer and things like that. Like, we're not really measuring how people are changing over time. We're just observing a couple of small, experiments and surveys, and we're making a lot of assertions about how people interact. And I think it's a good idea to, use this article as an example to kind of view how, that presents a really weird image that maybe it wouldn't have existed before. I find that, with Evo-psych, right, additionally, Evo-psych has a poor understanding of, how disabilities and illnesses and mental illnesses actually progress. Like, we have a lot of research to demonstrate that, certain behaviors, including, mental illnesses and things like that, but also more generalized behaviors, they're not actually encoded necessarily by your genes. Your genes can make you more at risk for this, because what happens is that when you have a body that's producing the wrong proteins from your genes, it can make you certain functions more likely to fail and lead to this kind of mental illness, right? But it doesn't mean that that actually means that that's actually what produces the mental illness. And it's also not the environmental pressure to select is not just the passing down of genes. It's also the ability to interact in a social environment. And this is also observed in other species. A basic example on the top of my head is just mating rituals. Mating rituals are basically abstract signals between two mates that are essentially develop to establish a communication between mates to be able to socially put their genes together. Like, even though male and female grebes could technically mate with anything, they actually mate based on a particular social interaction, because that social interaction establishes a communication of stability between the parents, so that one doesn't just randomly run off, right? And it's important to stress that it's a social progression that is happening among many individuals in a species, rather than individuals competing with their genes against each other. And that's really the fundamental problem with Evo-psych. It's looking at individual lines, and it's looking at these very basic individualist genetic models. Some models which I am pretty sure are very outdated in other evolutionary fields. I am not an evolutionary biologist, but I would love to hear other people's opinions on some of the models that we're going to view today. So first, I'm going to look at this, and I'm going to link this article in the description, but I want to go over the conclusion of this article to demonstrate the social consequences of thinking this way and assuming that just because it's a scientific paper that it must be scientific, that it must be accurate of what we're observing. So I want to stress this looks like a paper that was legitimately published. It doesn't look like something that was like fake. I'm not an expert, I'm just an average person, but there's nothing that's giving me any alarm bells. But I want to go down to the conclusion, because I just want to read this out loud real quick. The conclusion states, females enjoy absolute certainty that offspring they deliver are genetically related. Males always run the risk of those offspring being genetically unrelated. This asymmetry anchors diverging patterns of parental investment on the parts of females and males. A male's fitness is more likely to be enhanced through parental investment in offspring that she delivers. In contrast, a male must decide whether to continue parenting efforts, investing in the offspring with the risk that he is not genetically related to the offspring, or switching mating efforts, investing in efforts to mate and reproduce, which increases his chance of producing his own genetically related offspring. Signals that offspring are genetically unrelated to the male. Examples: perceived fidelity of the female, differences in child-male physical characteristics increases the likelihood that the male will reduce parental efforts and increase mating efforts. Given that it is the offspring's best genetic interest to extract as much investment from the parenting male as possible, a foundation is laid for father-offspring conflict. Now, the first thing I want to point out that this is a really weird conclusion, because it kind of sounds like they're trying to reconstruct something from Freudian psychoanalysis called the Oedipus complex. What they're really trying to describe here is the conflict between the interests of the father and the interests of the child, and how this produces conflict within a family. So that's a little weird. I just wanted to point that out. I don't really have much more to say on that, but the one thing I really want to focus on is I want to focus on how the way that having this very individualist view of how, we are supposed to pass down genes as a species actually reinforces a lot of certain social expectations that we see every day. And this is the reason why Evo-psych gets accused of being sexist. It's not just a matter of, oh, they say things that people don't like. It's actually the fact that the particular way that the situation is constructed is actually not complete, and it leads to a sexist conclusion because it's reflecting our own biases. To better explain this, let's return to the example of the grib. The grib uses its mating dance while it's traveling across a river to signify to its mate through a special language in the synchrony of that dance, right? To determine whether or not there is fidelity with that partner. Now, it's true that the partner may still bail, right? But the fact that they continued to do that dance, the fact that they continued to, you know, persist with that actually signifies enough to that mate that, yeah, this bird isn't going to bail on me, and I'm going to be able to raise my kids with it, right? Now, here's the thing that's really interesting about that. The question is, how does the female grebe know that if they do this dance together, it's going to be effective? Is that really caused by genetics? And the way that we can test this is by isolating animals away from their natural environment, by isolating them from other members of their species. Now, I don't think any research specifically on grebes has been done by this, but it's very well known that if you isolate members of a species from its native population, it exhibits very different behaviors, including reproductive behaviors. There's a very famous example of the alpha wolf model basically being outdated because of essentially how we viewed wolves as, oh, we can just take them out of the wild and we can just strip them from their environment and we can just plop them in a research facility together and we're just going to see how they function, versus actually seeing them in their original context in the wild. So if we return back to the grebes and we think for a second, what actually makes the female grebe understand that the dance is a signification for this fidelity? Well, it's the interactions that the grebe has with other grebes. When the grebe is unable to have the dance together, right, it is unable to even hold a relationship together. What the grebe learns through failing, through previous attempts at trying to mate with other birds and trying to, you know, do their dance with other birds, is they learn that, you know, there's a certain way to do the dance, right? There's a certain way to signify. And if you're really serious about it, you're going to put in a lot of investment into that signification. And that signification is not gathered from, you know, a genetic line, but actually the interactions that that grebe has with other birds. And you, as you can see, you don't need a particularly socialized species to have this kind of social transmission. So if we actually go back to the conclusion, we can see that we are focusing very heavily on the very specific structure of genetic transmission. They focus on the asymmetry of how females are able to ensure that their genetics are passed down while the male is not, because the male has to deal with the fact that their sperm might be replaced by something else, right? And what this is really saying is it's saying because a man has to choose between raising his kids who could possibly not be his, or, you know, having more kids so that they are necessarily his, right? He's looking for signals to indicate that the child is not, you know, his own by certain social behaviors, by looking at the fidelity of the female, by looking at the, you know, what the child looks like. This is a characteristic cheating situation. This is describing a very specific kind of relationship that we see a lot in our own culture. It's describing where cheating is coming from, basically, right? And it's saying that when a woman cheats, right, a man is essentially justified in leaving her, and essentially justified in, you know, questioning her and all these things, because it's just a genetic evolutionary development. But what this ignores is it ignores the extremely complex social interactions that humans have with each other that actually construct the situation of cheating in the first place. And this is why it's kind of weird that they don't seem to be aware that they're trying to recreate the Oedipus complex, because that's exactly the kind of thing that the Oedipus complex is trying to explain. But it's trying to explain it from a very different way than through evolution. You know, Freud, of all people, actually has a really good argument against evolutionary psychology. Now, normally I would not reference Freud as a rebuttal for many things unless we were talking about, like, specifically psychoanalysis or structures like that, because usually people don't really, you know, Freud is not really the same kind of thing. It's actually a very different field, and it's its own thing. In fact, you know, there were fields that were influenced by psychoanalysis and then tried to be scientific, such as behavioral psychology. So you can kind of see that there, you know, that's quite a bit different than being pseudoscience. But what Freud was trying to, you know, actually answer with his models words. He wasn't trying to explain, he was trying to explain, essentially, how we develop our behavior over time. And he recognized that there was actually a very important problem with trying to understand behavior solely through genetics and evolution. He points this out in a paper called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Now, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, basically what Freud is saying is that the pleasure principle is this idea that essentially animals and people base their behavior on things that attract them towards pleasure and move them away towards pain. But as Freud rightfully pointed out, he said this doesn't explain the nature of how we have a tendency to, have repeating traumas that seem to act very irrationally. And the thing about this observation is that this is something that we still observe today. We still observe people who are very heavily traumatized doing certain kinds of behaviors that not only seem irrational, but are often a sort of weird replication of, trauma that they've experienced in the past. And what Freud was trying to actually describe with his theater and with his description of childhood development and his development of sexuality was he was trying to explain a model where basically the development of our relationship with our desires is changed by interacting with itself, and more than just the behavior that's programmed into us to move towards pleasure and to move towards pain. There is some sort of internal process that is beyond this evolutionary principle that must drive behavior. And essentially how Freud answered this was he separated what we experience as our conscious behavior as a system of three parts. You have what is called the id, which is like the raw unconscious. This is like your raw sex drive, your raw desire. And you have the ego, which is what you would experience as yourself. And then you have the superego, which is a regulatory agent that is it's comparable to your conscience, right? So he developed this entire model as an attempt to try to explain this problem beyond the pleasure principle. And really, Evo-psych, evolutionary psychology, does not move beyond the pleasure principle. In fact, I would argue that out of all the fields in psychology, psychiatry, all that shit, neurology, evolutionary psychology, more than any other field, goes backwards. It goes backwards before Freud. Freud literally debunked this stuff in a way that is kind of hard to argue against. Yeah, you don't have to believe in everything that Freud said, but you have to admit, when it comes to beyond the pleasure principle, he has a point. People act irrationally in ways that don't reflect an evolutionary model. It doesn't reflect trying to preserve your genes. It doesn't reflect, trying to preserve your body. There's more to it. And because of that, Evo-psych is one of the most just unfounded sciences that people take seriously. And I really hope that this video helps explain why and helps people understand the problems with it.